Life with Jay was once a masterpiece, a vibrant painting filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of effortless connection that made every day feel like a scene from a romantic movie. We met at a friend's barbecue on a summer evening, the kind where the air is thick with the scent of grilled food and the sound of crickets chirping in the background. From the moment our eyes locked across the crowded yard, there was an undeniable spark. She had this infectious laugh, one that could light up even the darkest corners of my soul. And her ability to find humor in everything made life seem brighter. Together, we were unstoppable, so I thought. In those early days, our love felt invincible. Countless evenings were spent wandering through parks hand in hand, cooking meals together in our tiny kitchen, or binge-watching TV shows until the early hours of the morning. Every moment with Jay felt like magic, as if time itself slowed down just for us. Back then, my job was predictable, a steady 9-to-5 routine that left plenty of room for us to build a life together. But little did I know, fate had other plans. As my career began to demand more of me, cracks started forming in the foundation of what we had built. At first, it was subtle. Missing dinner dates here, canceling weekend plans there. I told myself it was temporary, that these sacrifices were necessary for a better future for us. But deep down, I could see the toll it was taking on Jay. Her once sparkling eyes dimmed ever so slightly. Her easy laugh became less frequent, and the silence between us grew heavier with each passing day. What used to be our sacred downtime, a time to reconnect after long days apart, turned into something unrecognizable. Instead of sharing stories over candlelit dinners, we found ourselves sitting side by side, yet miles apart emotionally, glued to our phones. The intimacy that had once come so naturally now felt forced, almost mechanical, like another item to check off my never-ending to-do list. It wasn't just the physical distance. It was the emotional chasm that widened with every unanswered text, every missed opportunity to truly be present for her. The turning point came during a particularly grueling week at work. I promised Jay we'd have a quiet night in, just the two of us, no distractions. But when I finally dragged myself home late that evening, exhausted and defeated, she was already asleep on the couch, a blanket draped loosely over her shoulders. The sight of her lying there, vulnerable and alone, hit me like a punch to the gut. That image haunted me for days, of the realization that I had let her down, not just once, but repeatedly. And while she never complained outright, her silence spoke volumes. Love doesn't always need words to express pain. And hers radiated in the way she avoided my gaze, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. It was as though the color was slowly fading from the vibrant portrait of our relationship, leaving behind a muted, hollow version of what we once were. Looking back, I can see how blind I was to the warning signs. My ambition, which I thought would bring us closer, only drove us further apart. Each late-night email, each unexpected call on a Saturday morning, chipped away at the bond we had worked so hard to create. By the time I realized the extent of the damage, it felt like trying to repair a shattered mirror. No matter how carefully you piece it back together, the cracks will always remain. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a storm that would test us in ways I couldn't have imagined. The cracks in our relationship didn't appear overnight, but rather like the slow erosion of a once mighty dam under relentless pressure. At first, they were almost imperceptible tiny fissures that I dismissed as temporary side effects of my increasingly demanding job. But as weeks turned into months, those small fractures widened into chasms that neither love nor good intentions could bridge. My new role at work demanded everything from me. Late nights hunched over spreadsheets, weekends tethered to emails, and an unrelenting sense of urgency that left little room for anything or anyone else. Jay tried to be understanding, or at least she pretended to be. She'd smile when I called to cancel plans, her voice steady as she said, "It's okay, I get it." But behind her forced cheerfulness, I could see the shadows of disappointment creeping into her eyes. One evening stands out vividly in my memory, not because it was dramatic, but because it encapsulated everything we had become. It was her birthday day I had circled on the calendar months ago with promises to make it special. Yet there I was, sitting alone at my desk in the dim glow of my computer screen, scrolling through endless documents while Jay waited for me at home. By the time I finally walked through the door, hours after midnight, she was sitting on the couch with tear-streaked cheeks and a half-empty glass of wine cradled in her hands. Her voice trembled as she asked why I hadn't even sent a text. "You forgot," she whispered, each word heavy with hurt. I stammered an apology, something hollow and insufficient about how busy I'd been. But before she could respond, my phone buzzed again, a reminder from work, pulling me back into its suffocating grip. Without thinking, I grabbed the device and muttered, "I'll make it up to you tomorrow," before retreating to my office to finish what felt like an endless task list. That night, as I sat surrounded by papers and glowing screens, I heard faint sobs coming from the other room. They weren't loud enough to disrupt my concentration, but sharp enough to pierce through my guilt-ridden conscience. I wanted to go to her, to hold her and tell her how much she meant to me, but instead, I stayed rooted to my chair, paralyzed by the weight of my responsibilities, perhaps by my own cowardice. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. I was choosing work over her, not just tonight, but every single day. And worse still, I knew deep down that Jay saw it too. The next morning, she avoided eye contact during breakfast, her silence speaking louder than any accusation ever could. From then on, the tension between us became palpable, simmering beneath the surface of every interaction. Small arguments erupted over trivial things, a misplaced set of keys, a forgotten grocery item, but they were never really about those things. They were about neglect, about feeling invisible in the face of my growing detachment. One particularly heated exchange occurred when I absent-mindedly left a wet towel on the bed after rushing out for an early meeting. Jay snapped, her frustration boiling over as she yelled, "Do you even care anymore?" Her question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. I wanted to reassure her, to say yes, of course I cared, but the words caught in my throat. How could I convince her when even I wasn't sure? As these moments piled up, so did the silences, the kind that stretch endlessly, filled with unspoken grievances and unresolved emotions. We stopped laughing together, stopped sharing stories about our days. Instead, we existed in parallel universes within the same apartment, passing each other like ghosts. Jay began snapping more frequently, her patience wearing thin, while I retreated further into my work, using it as both a shield and an excuse. Our connection, once vibrant and effortless, now felt strained and artificial, like trying to force two mismatched puzzle pieces together. Looking back, I realized that this period was the beginning of the end, slow unraveling that neither of us knew how to stop. But at the time, I convinced myself it was just a phase, that we would find our way back to each other once things settled down. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The idea of planning a romantic getaway to Italy wasn't just a spontaneous decision. It was my last-ditch effort to salvage what remained of our crumbling relationship. After months of emotional neglect and countless silent dinners, where we sat like strangers sharing the same space, I knew something drastic had to be done. Jay deserved more than the hollow version of me that came home exhausted from work each night, too drained to even hold a meaningful conversation. She deserved the man who once made her laugh until her sides hurt, the man who used to see her as his entire universe. So, with trembling determination, I poured every ounce of hope into crafting an unforgettable trip. I imagined Italy as our sanctuary, a place where we could escape the suffocating weight of routine and rediscover the magic that had brought us together in the first place. I spent weeks secretly organizing everything: flights, cozy boutique hotels tucked away in picturesque towns, reservations at intimate restaurants, and even handwritten notes for Jay detailing why she meant so much to me. When I finally revealed the surprise, her eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was excitement between US's flicker of the connection we'd lost, but desperately needed to reclaim. Italy didn't disappoint. From the moment we stepped off the plane, it seemed like the country itself conspired to bring us closer. We wandered through cobblestone streets hand in hand, indulged in decadent meals under twinkling fairy lights, and marveled at ancient ruins that whispered stories of timeless love. One evening in Venice stands out vividly, a moment so perfect it almost felt surreal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in hues of gold and crimson, we boarded a small gondola that glided silently through the labyrinthine canals. The air was warm, filled with the soft lapping of water against the boat and distant echoes of laughter from nearby piazzas. Jay leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand resting gently in mine. In that fleeting moment, it felt like all the cracks in our relationship had been smoothed over, like we were whole again. But perfection is often fragile, and reality has a cruel way of intruding when you least expect it. As we floated beneath a low stone bridge, Jay suddenly broke the silence. Her voice was quiet but carried an edge I couldn't ignore. "Do you really want to be here with me?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the rippling water. "Or are you just trying to fix things because you feel like it's your duty?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, shattering the fragile peace we'd built that evening. I stammered, searching for the right response. But no matter how sincerely I tried to reassure her, doubt lingered in her eyes. Her question haunted me long after we returned to our hotel. Was this trip truly about saving us? Or was I simply checking a box, fulfilling some unspoken obligation? The thought gnawed at me, planting seeds of insecurity I hadn't anticipated. That night, as Jay slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the realization that perhaps the distance between us ran deeper than I'd admitted even to myself. What had started as a hopeful journey toward healing now felt like walking a tightrope above an abyss, one misstep away from collapse. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The final days of our Italian escape were supposed to be the crescendo of our journey, a culmination of rediscovery and reconnection. Instead, they unraveled into a nightmare that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about Jay and our relationship. It was on the cliffs of Naples, with the vast expanse of the Mediterranean stretching endlessly before us, that the fragile illusion of healing shattered like glass. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the jagged rocks below. But its beauty felt cruelly ironic against the storm brewing between us. Jay stood there, her silhouette framed by the golden hues of dusk, yet her voice carried none of the warmth the scene promised. "I need space," she said, her tone icy and detached, as if delivering a verdict rather than sharing a feeling. "You being here, it's suffocating me. It feels like you're forcing this trip, forcing us." Her words hit me like a freight train, each syllable laced with accusation and finality. My chest tightened, my mind racing to process what she was saying. Wasn't this trip her idea too? Hadn't we planned it together, pouring hours of hope and effort into making it perfect? And now, after all the sacrifices I'd made to be here, she was telling me I was the problem. I stared at her, incredulous, searching her face for any sign of hesitation or doubt. But there was none. Her expression was resolute, almost cold, as though she had already checked out emotionally and was merely going through the motions of breaking the news. "So what are you saying?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That you want to stay here alone? Without me?" She nodded slowly, her eyes avoiding mine, and added, "I need time to figure things out, to find myself again." The weight of her words crushed me, not just because of their content, but because of how calculated they felt. This wasn't a spontaneous decision born out of passion or clarity. It was deliberate, premeditated, and utterly dismissive of everything we had worked toward during this trip. The irony stung bitterly. Here I was, trying to save our relationship, only to be told that my presence was part of the problem. "If that's what you really want," I replied, my voice rising with frustration, "then fine. But if you choose to stay, you do it on your own terms, dine your own dime." Her head snapped up at that, her calm facade cracking slightly. "You'd cut me off. Just like that." She shot back, her voice sharp with indignation. "How can you claim to care about me and then abandon me here?" Abandonment. The word reverberated in my mind, twisting the knife deeper. How dare she twist this around, painting herself as the victim when she was the one choosing to walk away? "This isn't abandonment, Jay," I shot back, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "It's accountability. If you want freedom, then take responsibility for it. Don't expect me to fund your self-discovery while you throw away everything we've built." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, mirroring the turmoil within me. Her gaze softened briefly, perhaps sensing the depth of my pain, but it was too late. The trust I had clung to so desperately throughout this trip had been obliterated in an instant. As I turned to leave, the salty breeze whipping against my face, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and resolve. This wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was clear now that our story couldn't continue not like this. When I returned from Italy, the weight of unresolved tension between Jay and me felt heavier than ever. What was supposed to be a trip of healing had instead become a catalyst for deeper fractures in our relationship. The arguments that followed were relentless, each one more exhausting than the last. Money became a recurring flashpoint. Her unexpected decision to extend her stay in Italy had left her financially strained. And she expected me to shoulder the burden without question. "You abandoned me there," she would say, her voice sharp with accusation, as if my refusal to fund her extended vacation was an act of betrayal rather than a boundary I needed to set. But it wasn't just about finances. It was about communication, or rather, the lack of it. Every conversation spiraled into accusations. She claimed I didn't understand her need for independence, while I argued that her choices disregarded the partnership we were supposed to share. The tension between us didn't exist in a vacuum. Our friends, who had once been a source of support, now seemed to take sides, further complicating an already volatile situation. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment nursing a cup of coffee, my phone buzzed incessantly, a call from KJ's closest friend. When I answered, her tone was anything but friendly. "How could you leave her stranded like that?" Kay demanded, her words cutting through the line like shards of glass. "She was in a foreign country, alone, and you just cut her off. Do you have any idea how hard that must have been for her?" Her voice dripped with disdain, and I could almost picture her shaking her head in disapproval on the other end of the call. I tried to explain my perspective, to make her see that this wasn't about abandonment, it was about accountability. "Kay, she made her choice to stay without discussing it with me," I said, my voice rising despite my attempt to remain calm. "I supported the original plan, but extending the trip, that wasn't something I agreed to." But Kay wasn't interested in hearing my side. To her, I was the villain, a cold, unfeeling partner who had failed Jay when she needed me most. Her judgment stung deeply, not because I doubted my decisions, but because it highlighted how isolated I had become. Even among our mutual friends, I felt like an outsider, someone whose actions were constantly scrutinized and misunderstood. Things only worsened during a group video call a few days later. Mark, one of our mutual friends, brought up the topic casually, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Dude, you left her stranded in Italy, that's harsh," he remarked, shaking his head as if delivering a verdict. Lisa chimed in soon after, her voice laced with criticism. Yeah, I get that you're upset, but cutting her off financially? That seems extreme." Their words hung in the air, heavy with judgment. And I found myself struggling to defend my position without sounding defensive or bitter. "This isn't about money," I insisted, my frustration bubbling over. "It's about being excluded from a major decision that affects both of us. It's about feeling like I'm not a partner anymore." But no matter how much I explained, their minds seemed made up. They saw Jay as the victim and me as the antagonist, unwilling to consider the complexity of the situation. As the call ended, I sat there in silence, the weight of their collective disapproval pressing down on me. For the first time, I questioned not only my relationship with Jay, but also the friendships I had relied on for years. Had they ever truly understood me, or had they simply chosen the narrative that painted me as the bad guy? The sense of isolation was suffocating, a stark reminder that sometimes even those closest to you can turn against you when emotions run high. And yet, amidst the chaos, I knew one thing for certain. This conflict was far from over. The unraveling of my relationship with Jay took a darker, more devastating turn when I stumbled upon shocking revelations that shattered whatever fragile trust remained between us. It began innocently enough, a chance encounter with Ben, a close friend who had always been like a brother to me. As we sat in a dimly lit cafe late one evening, his expression was uneasy, as though he carried a burden too heavy to bear alone. "Look, man," he started hesitantly, stirring his coffee slowly. "I wasn't going to say anything at first, because it didn't feel like my place, but you deserve to know." His words hung in the air, ominous and foreboding. What followed felt like a punch to the gut. Jay had borrowed significant sums of money during her extended stay in Italy, indulging in wild parties and reckless behavior. Worse still, she had met someone else, a man whose identity remained vague, but whose presence loomed large over our fractured relationship. My mind raced as Ben continued, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. "There's talk that she's pregnant," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The room seemed to spin around me, the world tilting on its axis. Pregnant? My stomach churned at the thought, not just of the betrayal itself, but of the implications. Was this why she wanted to stay in Italy? Was this why she pushed me away so abruptly? Ben's next words were even more damning. "Some people are saying she might try to claim the baby is yours too, make you take responsibility." The accusation hit me like a freight train, leaving me breathless and disoriented. How could she even consider such a thing? The woman I loved, the person I had planned a future with, was now being painted as someone capable of deception so profound it made my chest ache with disbelief. Determined to uncover the truth, I turned to KJ's closest confidant, hoping for clarity or perhaps closure. Our meeting took place in a quiet cafe, the kind where whispered conversations blended seamlessly into the hum of background chatter. As I probed cautiously, Kay's guarded demeanor confirmed my worst fears. She panicked when she found out, Kay admitted reluctantly, her voice trembling. She didn't know what to do, so she got a paternity test done. "You're not the father." Her words landed like a hammer blow, confirming both my suspicions and my heartbreak. But Kay wasn't finished. In her panic, she thought maybe pretending the baby was yours would bring you back, that it could fix everything between you two. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as her confession sank in. Jay had considered lying not just to me, but to an innocent child to manipulate the situation for her own gain. The betrayal stung sharply, a second wound layered atop the first. I felt nauseous, the weight of her desperation pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. This wasn't just about infidelity or financial irresponsibility. It was about trust obliterated, about the calculated manipulation of something sacred. As Kay spoke, her loyalty to Jay warring with her moral compass. I realized how deeply Jay's actions had spiraled out of control. Her fear and confusion had driven her to extremes, but they also revealed a side of her I barely recognized, a side willing to sacrifice honesty and integrity for fleeting stability. Sitting there, staring at the remnants of my coffee, I felt the full force of the betrayal wash over me. Love, once vibrant and unshakable, now lay in ruins, its foundation eroded by lies and poor decisions. And yet, amidst the pain, a grim resolve began to form. I knew I had to confront Jay not out of anger, but out of necessity. The truth, no matter how painful, was the only path forward. The day I decided to confront Jay was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. After 3 sleepless nights spent wrestling with anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss, I knew there was no other way forward. Clarity, at least closure, was necessary, even if it meant tearing down the remnants of what we once had. I chose our favorite cafe for this final conversation, a place where countless memories lingered in every corner. Lazy Sunday afternoons sipping cappuccinos. Laughter that spilled into the quiet hum of background chatter. And whispered promises about a future neither of us could foresee would crumble so completely. It felt fitting, almost poetic, to end things a bittersweet farewell to the life we built together. When I arrived, Jay was already seated by the window, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of tea. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than I remembered, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. As I approached, my heart pounded with a mix of dread and resolve. Sitting across from her felt surreal, like staring at a ghost of someone I used to know intimately, but now barely recognized. The air between us was heavy, charged with unspoken grievances and the weight of everything that had gone unsaid since Italy. "I know everything, Jay," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I know about the guy in Italy, the pregnancy, and your plan to make me believe the baby might be mine." Her face crumpled instantly, tears spilling down her cheeks as she struggled to find words. I thought maybe if you believed it was yours, we could go back to how things were," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I panicked." Her confession hit me like a tidal wave, each word reopening wounds I thought I'd begun to heal. But beneath the pain was something sharper: pity. Pity not just for her, but for us, for the love we once shared, now reduced to manipulation and desperation. "Jay," I said softly, though my tone carried an edge of finality, "we can't go back. Trust doesn't work that way. You broke it not just with your actions, but with the lies you considered telling. This isn't something I can overlook." She started sobbing harder, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. "Please," she begged, reaching out to grab my hand. "Just give me one more chance. I'll fix this. I promise. We can start over." Her plea tore at me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Starting over required trust, honesty, and mutual effort, things she had willingly sacrificed when she chose her path without considering mine. I pulled my hand away gently, my resolve hardening. "You made your choice, Jay," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "You stayed in Italy, pursued someone else, and lied about the baby. Those weren't mistakes, they were decisions. And now, I have to make mine." I paused, letting the gravity of my words sink in before continuing. "I'll help you pay off the debts from the trip. That's the last thing I can do for you, out of whatever love is left. But after that, we're done." Her sobs grew louder, drawing glances from nearby patrons, but I couldn't soften the blow. Not this time. For years, I had bent over backward to save us, to keep the fragments of our relationship intact. But some fractures are too deep to mend, and I realized then that staying would only prolong the inevitable. As I stood up to leave, the weight of the moment pressed down on me. This was at the definitive end of a chapter I had clung to for so long. "MG Chen Kan Huang," CAI said quietly, my voice breaking slightly. "Gig en hung kung fi Chen Kan Huang, CAN." With those final words, I turned and walked away, leaving behind not just Jay, but the person I used to be, the man who believed love alone could conquer anything. Outside, the cool air hit my face, sharp and cleansing. Though sorrow lingered, I felt lighter, freer, ready to step into whatever came next. In the days following my final conversation with Jay, I found myself adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. The apartment, once filled with her laughter and the comforting hum of our shared life, now felt cavernous and hollow. Each room seemed to echo with memories we had created together: the cozy dinners by candlelight, the lazy Sunday mornings spent wrapped in blankets, and even the quiet moments when words weren't necessary. But amidst the nostalgia, there was also an overwhelming sense of relief. Closing this chapter wasn't easy, but it was necessary, a painful yet liberating act of self-preservation. I often sat alone on the balcony in the evenings, staring out at the city skyline as twilight painted the horizon in hues of orange and purple. Those moments were bittersweet. Tay carried the weight of everything. Jay and I had lost, but also the clarity that came with acceptance. My mind would inevitably wander back to happier times, to Venice, where her hand had fit so perfectly in mine, or to Rome, where her eyes sparkled under fairy lights as she talked about our future. Yet each time those memories surfaced, I forced myself to confront the truth. Holding on to what was already broken wouldn't mend it. Sometimes letting go is the only way to find yourself again. I whispered into the empty air, repeating the mantra like a lifeline keeping me anchored. The support from the community during this tumultuous period became my beacon of hope. Their stories reminded me that heartbreak, though deeply personal, is also universal, a shared human experience that connects us all. Reading their comments, I realized how much strength I had drawn from their wisdom and encouragement. They helped me see that ending things with Jay wasn't just about loss, it was about reclaiming my identity, which had been overshadowed by months of strain and betrayal. Still, there were nights when loneliness pressed down on me like a heavy fog, threatening to pull me under. On those nights, I allowed myself to grieve for the love we'd lost, for the dreams we'd abandoned. But as dawn broke, bringing with it the promise of a new day, I reminded myself why I had made the choices I did. Life without Jay might feel uncertain now, but it was also full of possibility, blank canvas waiting to be painted. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed I could face whatever came next, not as half of a fractured whole, but as someone whole on my own. As I stood to leave the cafe, my legs felt heavy, as though each step required more effort than the last. The weight of our final conversation still hung in the air, thick and suffocating, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee that clung to the room. Just as I turned to walk away, Jay reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed a folded piece of paper into mine. "Please, read this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the bustling crowd around us. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was a resolve in them, a fleeting attempt to salvage something from the wreckage we had become. I hesitated, clutching the letter tightly in my hand, its edges sharp against my palm. For a moment, I considered staying, demanding answers or confronting her about the words scrawled inside. But before I could say anything, she slipped away, disappearing into the throng of people outside the cafe window. I watched her go, her figure growing smaller and smaller until it blended seamlessly into the sea of strangers. The sight left me hollow, an ache settling deep in my chest, emptiness that no amount of closure could fill. Unfolding the letter with trembling hands, I began to read. Her handwriting was hurried yet deliberate, each word dripping with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. But please believe my regret at all. I acted out of fear, not love, and now I've lost the one person who truly mattered. I still love you more than you'll ever know. Asterisk. The words blurred as my vision clouded with conflicting emotions, anger, pity, sorrow, colliding at once. Her apology felt raw, genuine, but it came too late, like trying to patch a dam moments before it bursts. As I lowered the letter, the noise of the cafe seemed to fade, replaced by the deafening silence of unanswered questions. Had she truly meant what she wrote, or was this another desperate attempt to hold on to something already broken? Standing there alone, surrounded by strangers, oblivious to my turmoil, I realized the truth. Some wounds run too deep to heal, no matter how sincere the remorse. And as I stepped out into the crowded streets, the letter crumpled in my fist. I knew this chapter was irrevocably closed.